Chapter 14 of Tess of the d'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tess of the d'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy. Read by Adrian Pretzelis. Chapter 14. It was a hazy sunrise in August. The denser nocturnal vapours, attacked by the warm beams, were dividing and shrinking into isolated fleeces within hollows and coverts, where they waited till they should be dried away to nothing. The sun, on account of the mist, had a curious sentient, personal look, demanding the masculine pronoun for its adequate expression. His present aspect, coupled with the lack of all human forms in the scene, explained the old-time heliolatries in a moment. One could feel that a saner religion had never prevailed under the sky. The luminary was a golden-haired, beaming, mild-eyed, godlike creature, gazing down in the vigour and intentness of youth upon an earth that was brimming with an interest for him. His light, a little later, broke through chinks of cottage shutters, throwing stripes like red-hot pokers upon cupboards, chests of drawers, and other furniture within, and awakening harvesters who were not already astir. But of all ruddy things that morning the brightest were two broad arms of painted wood which rose from the margin of a yellow cornfield hard by Marlott village. They, with two others below, formed the revolving Maltese cross of the reaping machine which had been brought to the field on the previous evening to be ready for operations this day. The paint with which they were smeared, intensified in hue by the sunlight, imparted to them a look of having been dipped in liquid fire. The field had already been opened. That is to say, a lane a few feet wide had been hand-cut through the wheat along the whole circumference of the field, for the first passage of the horses and machine. Two groups, one of men and lads, the other of women, had come down the eastern lane just at the hour when the shadows of the eastern hedge-top struck the west hedge midway, so that the heads of the groups were enjoying sunrise, while their feet were still in the dawn. They disappeared from the lane between the two stone posts which flanked the nearest field gate. Presently there arose from within a ticking like the love-making of the grasshopper. The machine had begun, and a moving concatenation of three horses and the aforesaid long rickety machine was visible over the gate, a driver sitting upon one of the hauling horses, and an attendant on the seat of the implement. Along one side of the field the whole wain went, the arms of the mechanical reaper revolving slowly till it passed down the hill quite out of sight. In a minute it came up on the other side of the field at the same equable pace. The glistening brass star in the forehead of the fore-horse first catching the eye as it rose into view over the stubble, then the bright arms, and then the whole machine. The narrow lane of stubble encompassing the field grew wider with each circuit, and the standing corn was reduced to small area as the morning wore on. Rabbits, hares, snakes, rats, mice retreated inwards as into a fastness, unaware of the ephemeral nature of their refuge and of the doom that awaited them later in the day when, their coverts shrinking to a more and more horrible narrowness, they were huddled together, friends and foes, till the last few yards of upright wheat fell also under the teeth of the unerring reaper, and they were every one put to death by the sticks and stones of the harvesters. The reaping machine left the fallen corn behind it in little heaps, each heap being of the quantity for a sheaf, and upon these the active binders in the rear laid their hands, mainly women, but some of them men in print shirts and trousers supported round their waists by leather straps, rendering useless the two buttons behind, which twinkled and bristled with sunbeams at every movement of each wearer, as if they were a pair of eyes in the small of his back. But those of the other sex were the most interesting of this company of binder, by reason of the charm which is acquired by woman when she becomes part and parcel of outdoor nature, and is not merely an object set down therein as in ordinary times. A field man is a personality afield. A field woman is a portion of the field. She has somehow lost her own margin, imbibed the essence of her surrounding, and assimilated herself with it. The women, or rather girls, for they were mostly young, wore drawn cotton bonnets with great flapping curtains to keep off the sun, and gloves to prevent their hands being wounded by the stubble. There was one wearing a pale pink jacket, another in a cream-coloured tight-sleeved gown, another in a petticoat as red as the arms of the reaping machine, and others, older, in the brown rough wropper all over, the old established and most appropriate dress of the field woman, which the young ones were abandoning. This morning the eye returns involuntarily to the girl in the pink cotton jacket, she being the most flexuous and finely drawn figure of them all. But her bonnet is pulled so far over her brow that none of her face is disclosed while she binds, though her complexion may be guessed from a stray twine or two of dark brown hair which extends below the curtain of her bonnet. Perhaps one reason why she seduces casual attention is that she never courts it, though the other women often gaze around them. Her binding proceeds with clock-like monotony. From the sheaf last finished she draws a handful of ears, patting their tips with her left palm to bring them even. Then, stooping low, she moves forwards, gathering the corn with both hands against her knees, and pushing her left gloved hand under the bundle to meet the right on the other side, holding the corn in an embrace like that of a lover. She brings the ends of the bond together, and kneels on the sheaf while she ties it, beating back her skirts now and then when lifted by the breeze. A bit of her naked arm is visible between the buff leather of the gauntlet and the sleeve of her gown, and as the day wears on its feminine smoothness becomes scarified by the stubble, and bleeds. At intervals she stands up to rest, and to retire her disarranged apron, or to pull her bonnet straight. Then one can see the oval face of a handsome young woman, with deep dark eyes and long heavy clinging tresses, which seems to clasp in a beseeching way anything they fall against. The cheeks are paler, the teeth more regular, the red lips thinner than is usual in a country-bred girl. It is Tess Durbeyfield, otherwise d'Urberville, somewhat changed. The same, but not the same. At the present stage of her existence living as a stranger and an alien here, though it was no strange land that she was in. After a long seclusion she had come to a resolve to undertake outdoor work in her native village, the busiest season of the year in the agricultural world having arrived, and nothing that she could do within the house being so remunerative for the time as harvesting in the fields. The movements of the other women were more or less similar to Tess's, the whole bevy of them drawing together like dancers in a quadrille at the completion of a sheaf by each, every one placing her sheaf on end against those of the rest, till a shock, or stitch, as it was here called, of 10 or a dozen was formed. They went to breakfast and came again, and the work proceeded as before. As the hour of 11 drew near, a person watching her might have noticed that every now and then Tess's glance flitted wistfully to the brow of the hill, though she did not pause in her sheafing. On the verge of the hour the heads of a group of children, of ages ranging from 6 to 14, rose above the stubbly convexity of the hill. The face of Tess flushed slightly, but still she did not pause. The eldest of the comers, a girl who wore a triangular shawl, its corner draggling on the stubble, carried in her arms what at first sight seemed to be a doll, but proved to be an infant in long clothes. Another brought some lunch. The harvesters ceased working, took their provisions, and sat down against one of the shocks. Here they fell to, the men plying a stone jar freely and passing round a cup. Tess Durbeyfield had been one of the last to suspend her labours. She sat down at the end of the shock, her face turned somewhat away from her companions. When she had deposited herself, a man in a rabbit-skin cap and with a red handkerchief tucked into his belt held the cup of ale over the top of the shock for her to drink, but she did not accept his offer. As soon as her lunch was spread, she called up the big girl, her sister, and took the baby of her, who, glad to be relieved of the burden, went away to the next shock and joined the other children playing there. Tess, with a curiously stealthy yet courageous movement, and with a still rising colour, unfastened her frock and began suckling the child. The men who sat nearest considerately turned their faces towards the other end of the field, some of them beginning to smoke, one, with absent-minded fondness, regretfully stroking the jar that would no longer yield a stream. All the women but Tess fell into animated talk, and adjusted the disarranged knots of their hair. When the infant had taken its fill, the young mother sat it upright in her lap, and looking into the far distance dandled it with a gloomy indifference that was almost dislike. Then, all of a sudden, she fell to violently kissing it some dozens of times, as if she could never leave off, the child crying at the vehemence of an onset which strangely combined passionateness with contempt. "She's fond o' that there child, though she mid pretend to hate en, and say she wishes the baby and her too were in the churchyard," observed the woman in the red petticoat. "She'll soon leave off saying that," replied the one in buff. "Lord, 'tis wonderful what a body can get used to at that sort in time." "A little more than persuading had to do with her coming on't, I reckon. There were they that had heard her sobbing one night last year in the Chase, and it mid have gone hard wi' a certain party if folks had come along. Well, a little more or a little less, 'twas 1,000 pities that should ha' happened to she of all others. But 'tis always the comeliest. The plain ones be as safe as churches, Jenny?" The speaker turned to one of the group who certainly was not ill-defined as plain. It was 1,000 pities indeed. It was impossible for even an enemy to feel otherwise on looking at Tess as she sat there, with her flower-like mouth and large tender eyes, neither black nor blue nor grey nor violet, rather all those shades together, and 100 others, which could be seen if one looked into their irises, shade behind shade, tint beyond tint, around pupils that had no bottom, an almost standard woman, but for the slight incautiousness of character inherited from her race. A resolution which had surprised herself had brought her into the fields this week for the first time during many months. After wearing and wasting her palpitating heart with every engine of regret that lonely inexperience could devise, common sense had illumined her. She felt that she would do well to be useful again, to taste anew sweet independence at any price. The past was past. Whatever it had been, it was no more at hand. Whatever its consequences, time would close over them. They would all in a few years be as if they had never been, and she herself grassed down and forgotten. Meanwhile the trees were just as green as before, the birds sang, and the sun shone as clearly now as ever. The familiar surroundings had not darkened because of her grief, nor sickened because of her pain. She might have seen that what had bowed her head so profoundly, the thought of the world's concern at her situation, was founded on an illusion. She was not an existence, an experience, a passion, a structure of sensations to anybody but herself. To all humankind besides, Tess was only a passing thought. Even to friends she was no more than a frequently passing thought. If she made herself miserable the livelong night and day, it was only this much to them: "Ah, she makes herself unhappy." If she tried to be cheerful, to dismiss all care, to take pleasure in the daylight, the flowers, the baby, she could only be this idea to them: "Ah, she bears it very well." Moreover, alone in a desert island, would she have been wretched at what had happened to her? Not greatly. If she could have been but just created to discover herself as a spouseless mother, with no experience of life except as the parent of a nameless child, would the position have caused her to despair? No, she would have taken it calmly, and found pleasures therein. Most of the miseries had been generated by her conventional aspect, and not by her innate sensations. Whatever Tess's reasoning, some spirit had induced her to dress herself up neatly as she had formerly done, and come out into the fields, harvest hands being greatly in demand just then. This was why she had borne herself with dignity, and had looked people calmly in the face at times, even when holding the baby in her arms. The harvestmen rose from the shock of corn, and stretched their limbs, and extinguished their pipes. The horses, which had been unharnessed and fed, were again attached to the scarlet machine. Tess, having quickly eaten her own meal, beckoned to her eldest sister to come and take away the baby, fastened her dress, put on the buff gloves again, and stooped anew to draw a bond from the last completed sheaf for the tying of the next. In the afternoon and evening the proceedings of the morning were continued, Tess staying on till dusk with the body of harvesters. Then they all rode home in one of the largest waggons, in the company of a broad tarnished moon that had risen from the ground to the eastwards, its face resembling the outworn gold-leaf halo of some worm-eaten Tuscan saint. Tess's female companions sang songs, and showed themselves very sympathetic and glad at her reappearance out of doors, though they could not refrain from mischievously throwing in a few verses of the ballad about the maid who went to the merry greenwood and came back in a changed state. There are counterpoises and compensations in life, and the event which had made of her a social warning had also for the moment made her the most interesting personage in the village to many. Their friendliness won her still further away from herself, their lively spirits were contagious, and she became almost gay. But now that her moral sorrows were passing away, a fresh one arose on the natural side of her which knew no social law. When she reached home it was to learn to her grief that the baby had been suddenly taken ill since the afternoon. Some such collapse had been probable, so tender and puny was its frame, but the event came as a shock nevertheless. The baby's offence against society in coming into the world was forgotten by the girl-mother. Her soul's desire was to continue that offence by preserving the life of the child. However, it soon grew clear that the hour of emancipation for that little prisoner of the flesh was to arrive earlier than her worst misgivings had conjectured. And when she had discovered this, she was plunged into a misery which transcended that of the child's simple loss. Her baby had not been baptized. Tess had drifted into a frame of mind which accepted passively the consideration that if she should have to burn for what she had done, burn she must, and there was an end to it. Like all village girls, she was well grounded in the Holy Scriptures, and had dutifully studied the histories of Aholah and Aholibah, and knew the inferences to be drawn therefrom. But when the same question arose with regard to the baby, it had a very different colour. Her darling was about to die. and no salvation. It was nearly bedtime, but she rushed downstairs and asked if she might send for the parson. The moment happened to be one at which her father's sense of the antique nobility of his family was highest, and his sensitivities to the smudge which Tess had set upon that nobility most pronounced, for he had just returned from his weekly booze at Rolliver's Inn. No parson should come inside his door, he declared, prying into his affairs just then, when by her shame it had become more necessary than ever to hide them. He locked the door and put the key in his pocket. The household went to bed, and, distressed beyond measure, Tess retired also. She was continually waking as she lay, and in the middle of the night found that the baby was still worse. It was obviously dying, quietly and painlessly, but none the less surely. In her misery she rocked herself upon the bed. The clock struck the solemn hour of 1, that hour when fancy stalks outside reason, and malignant possibilities stand rock firm as facts. She thought of the child consigned to the nethermost corner of hell as its double doom for lack of baptism and lack of legitimacy, saw the arch-fiend tossing it with his three-pronged fork, like the one they used for heating the oven on baking days, to which picture she added many other quaint and curious details of torment sometimes taught to the young in this Christian country. The lurid presentiment so powerfully affected her imagination in the silence of the sleeping house that her nightgown became damp with perspiration, and the bedstead shook with each throb of her heart. The infant's breathing grew more difficult, and the mother's mental tension increased. It was useless to devour the little thing with kisses. She could stay in bed no longer, and walked feverishly about the room. "O merciful God, have pity! Have pity upon my poor baby!" she cried. "Heap as much anger as you want to upon me, and welcome, but pity the child!" She leant against the chest of drawers, and murmured incoherent supplications for a long while, till she suddenly started up. "Ah! Perhaps baby can be saved! Perhaps it will be just the same!" She spoke so brightly that it seemed as though her face might have shone in the gloom surrounding her. She lit a candle, and went to a second and a third bed under the wall, where she awoke her young sisters and brothers, all of whom occupied the same room. Pulling out the washing-stand so that she could get behind it, she poured some water from a jug, and made them kneel around, putting their hands together with fingers exactly vertical; while the children, scarcely awake, awe-stricken at her manner, their eyes growing larger and larger, remained in this position. She took the baby from her bed, a child's child, so immature as scarce to seem a sufficient personality to endow its producer with the maternal title. Tess then stood erect with the infant on her arm beside the basin. The next sister held the prayer book open before her, as the clerk at church held it before the parson, and thus the girl set about baptizing her child. Her figure looked singularly tall and imposing as she stood in her long white nightgown, a thick cable of twisted dark hair hanging straight down her back to her waist. The kindly dimness of the weak candle abstracted from her form and features the little blemishes which sunlight might have revealed, the stubble scratches upon her wrists, and the weariness of her eyes; her high enthusiasm having a transfiguring effect upon the face which had been her undoing, showing it as a thing of immaculate beauty, with a touch of dignity which was almost regal. The little ones kneeling round, their sleepy eyes blinking and red, awaited her preparations full of a suspended wonder, which their physical heaviness at that hour would not allow to become active. The most impressed of them said, "Be you really going to christen him, Tess?" The girl mother replied in a grave affirmative. "What's his name going to be?" She had not thought of that, but a name suggested by a phrase in the book of Genesis came into her head as she proceeded with the baptismal service, and now she pronounced it. "Sorrow, I baptize thee in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost." She sprinkled the water, and there was silence. "And say Amen, children." The tiny voices piped in obedient response. "Amen." Tess went on. "We receive this child," and so forth, "and do sign him with the sign of the cross." Here she dipped her hand into the basin, and fervently drew an immense cross upon the baby with her forefinger, continuing with the customary sentences as to his manfully fighting against sin, the world, and the devil, and being a faithful soldier and servant until his life's end. She duly went on with the Lord's Prayer, and the children lisping it after her in a thin, gnat-like wail, till, at the conclusion, raising their voices to Clark's pitch, they again piped into the silence, "Amen." Then their sister, with much augmented confidence in the efficacy of this sacrament, poured forth from the bottom of her heart the thanksgiving that follows, uttering it boldly and triumphantly in the stopped diapason note which her voice acquired when her heart was in her speech, and which will never be forgotten by those who knew her. The ecstasy of faith almost apotheosized her. It set upon her face a glowing irradiation, and brought a red spot into the middle of each cheek, while the miniature candle flame inverted in her eye pupils shone like a diamond. The children gazed up at her with more and more reverence, and no longer had a will for questioning. She did not look like Sissy to them now, but as a large, towering, and awful, a divine personage with whom they had nothing in common. Poor Sorrow's campaign against sin, the world, and the devil was doomed to be of limited brilliancy. Luckily perhaps for himself, considering his beginnings. In the blue of the morning that fragile soldier and servant breathed his last, and when the other children awoke they cried bitterly and begged Sissy to have another pretty baby. The calmness which had possessed Tess since the christening remained with her in the infant's loss. In the daylight, indeed, she felt her terrors about his soul to have been somewhat exaggerated. Whether well founded or not, she had no uneasiness now, reasoning that if Providence would not ratify such an act of approximation, she, for one, did not value the kind of heaven lost by the irregularity, either for herself or for her child. So passed away Sorrow the undesired, that inobtrusive creature, that bastard gift of shameless nature who respects not the social law, a waif to whom eternal time had been a matter of days merely, who knew not that such things as years and centuries ever were, to whom the cottage interior was the universe, the week's weather climate, newborn babyhood human existence, and the instinct to suck human knowledge. Tess, who mused on the christening a good deal, wondered if it were doctrinally sufficient to secure a Christian burial for the child. Nobody could tell this but the parson of the parish, and he was a newcomer, and did not know her. She went to his house after dusk, and stood by the gate, but could not summon courage to go in. The enterprise would have been abandoned if she had not by accident met him coming homeward as she turned away. In the gloom she did not mind speaking freely. "I should like to ask you something, sir." He expressed his willingness to listen, and she told the story of the baby's illness and the extemporized ordinance. "And now, sir," she added earnestly, "can you tell me this? Will it be just the same for him as if you had baptized him?" Having the natural feelings of a tradesman at finding that a job he should have been called in for had been unskilfully botched by his customers among themselves, he was disposed to say no. Yet the dignity of the girl, the strange tenderness in her voice, combined to affect his nobler impulses, or rather those that he had left in him after 10 years of endeavour to graft technical belief on actual scepticism. The man and the ecclesiastic fought within him, and the victory fell to the man. "My dear girl," he said, "it will be just the same." "Then you will give him a Christian burial?" she asked quickly. The vicar felt himself cornered. Hearing of the baby's illness, he had conscientiously gone to the house after nightfall to perform the rite, and, unaware that the refusal to admit him had come from Tess's father and not from Tess, he could not allow the plea of necessity for its irregular administration. "Ah, that's another matter," he said. "Another matter? Why?" asked Tess rather warmly. "Well, I would willingly do so if only we two were concerned, but I must not for certain reasons." "Just for once, sir." "Really, I must not." "Oh, sir!" She seized his hand as she spoke. He withdrew it, shaking his head. "Then I don't like you!" she burst out. "And I'll never come to your church no more." "Don't talk so rashly." "Will it be just the same? Don't for God's sake speak as saint to sinner, but as you yourself to me, myself. Poor me!" How the vicar reconciled his answer with the strict notions he supposed himself to hold on the subject is beyond a layman's power to tell, though not to excuse. Somewhat moved, he said, "In this case also it will be just the same." So the baby was carried in a small deal box under an ancient woman's shawl to the churchyard that night, and buried by lantern light, at the cost of a shilling and a pint of beer to the sexton, in that shabby corner of God's allotment where He let the nettles grow, and where all unbaptized infants, notorious drunkards, suicides, and others of the conjecturally damned were laid. In spite of the untoward surroundings, however, Tess bravely made a little cross of 2 laths and a piece of string, and having bound it with flowers, she stuck it up at the head of the grave one evening when she could enter the churchyard without being seen, putting at the foot also a bunch of the same flowers in a little jar of water to keep them alive. What matter was it that on the outside of the jar the eye of mere observation noted the words "Keelwell's Marmalade"? The eye of maternal affection did not see them in its vision of higher things. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Tess of the d'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tess of the d'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy. Read by Adrian Pretzelis. Chapter 15. By experience, says Roger Ascham, we find out a short way by a long wandering. Not seldom that long wandering unfits us for further travel, and of what use is our experience to us then? Tess Durbeyfield's experience was of this incapacitating kind. At last she had learned what to do, but who would now accept her doing? If before going to the d'Urbervilles she had vigorously moved under the guidance of sundry gnomic texts and phrases known to her and to the world in general, no doubt she would never have been imposed on. But it had not been in Tess's power, nor is it in anybody's power, to feel the whole truth of golden opinions while it is possible to profit from them. She, and how many more, might have ironically said to God with St. Augustine, "Thou hast counselled a better course than thou hast permitted." She remained in her father's house during the winter months, plucking fowls or cramming turkeys and geese, or making clothes for her sisters and brothers out of some finery which d'Urberville had given her and she had put by with contempt. Apply to him she would not. But she would often clasp her hands behind her head and muse when she was supposed to be working hard. She philosophically noted dates as they came past in the revolution of the year: the disastrous night of her undoing at Trantridge, with its dark background of the chase; also the dates of the baby's birth and death; also her own birthday, and every other day individualized by events in which she had taken some share. She suddenly thought one afternoon, when looking in the glass at her fairness, that there was yet another date of greater importance to her than these, that of her own death, when all these charms would have disappeared; a day which lay sly and unseen among all the other days of the year, giving no sign or sound when she annually passed over it, but not the less surely there. When was it? Why did she not feel the chill of each yearly encounter with such a cold relation? She had Jeremy Taylor's thought that some time in the future those who had known her would say, "It is the day that poor Tess Durbeyfield died," and there would be nothing singular in their minds in the sentiment of that day, doomed to be her terminus in time through all the ages. She did not know the place in month, week, season, or year. Almost at a leap Tess thus changed from simple girl to complex woman. Symbols of reflectiveness passed into her face, and a note of tragedy at times into her voice. Her eyes grew larger and more eloquent. She became what would have been called a fine creature. Her aspect was fair and arresting, her soul that of a woman whom the turbulent experiences of the last year or two had quite failed to demoralize. But for the world's opinion those experiences would have been simply a liberal education. She had held so aloof of late that her trouble, never generally known, was nearly forgotten in Marlott. But it became evident to her that she could never be really comfortable again in a place which had seen the collapse of her family's attempt to claim kin, and through her even closer union, with the rich d'Urbervilles. At least she could not be comfortable there till long years should have obliterated her keen consciousness of it. Yet even now Tess felt the pulse of hopeful life still warm within her. She might be happy in some nook which had no memories. To escape the past and all that appertained thereto was to annihilate it, and to do that she would have to get away. Was once lost always lost really true of chastity? She would ask herself. She might prove it false if she could veil bygones. The recuperative power which pervaded organic nature was surely not denied to maidenhood alone. She waited a long time without finding opportunity for a new departure. A particularly fine spring came round, and the stir of germination was almost audible in the buds. It moved her as it moved the wild animals, and made her passionate to go. At last, one day in early May, a letter reached her from a former friend of her mother's, to whom she had addressed inquiries long before, a person whom she had never seen, that a skilful milkmaid was required at a dairy house many miles to the southward, and that the dairyman would be glad to have her for the summer months. It was not quite so far off as could have been wished, but it was probably far enough, her radius of movement and repute having been so small. To persons of limited spheres, miles are as geographical degrees, parishes are counties, counties as provinces or kingdoms. On one point she was resolved. There should be no more d'Urberville air castles in the dreams and deeds of her new life. She would be the dairymaid Tess, and nothing more. Her mother knew Tess's feeling on this point so well, though no words had passed between them on the subject, that she never alluded to the knightly ancestry now. Yet such is human inconsistency that one of the interests of the new place to her was the accidental virtue of it lying near her forefathers' country, for they were not Blakemore men, though her mother was Blakemore to the bone. The dairy called Talbothays, for which she was bound, stood not remotely from one of the former estates of the d'Urbervilles, near the great family vaults of her granddames and their powerful husbands. She would be able to look at them and think not only that d'Urberville, like Babylon, had fallen, but that the individual innocence of a humble descendant could lapse as silently. All the while she wondered if any strange good thing might come of her being in her ancestral land, and some spirit within her rose automatically as the sap in the twigs. It was unexpended youth, surging up anew after its temporary check, and bringing with it hope and the invincible instinct towards self-delight. End of chapter 15. End of Phase the Second. Chapter 16 of Tess of the d'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tess of the d'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy. Read by Adrian Pretzelis. Phase the Third. The Rally. Chapter 16. On a time-scented, bird-hatching morning in May, between 2 and 3 years after the return from Trantridge, silent, reconstructive years for Tess Durbeyfield, she left her home for the second time. Having packed up her luggage so that it could be sent to her later, she started in a hired trap for the little town of Stour Castle, through which it was necessary to pass on her journey, now in a direction almost opposite to that of her first adventuring. On the curve of the nearest hill she looked back regretfully at Marlott and her father's house, although she had been so anxious to get away. Her kindred dwelling there would probably continue their daily lives as heretofore, with no great diminution of pleasure in their consciousness, although she would be far off, and they deprived of her smile. In a few days the children would engage in their games as merrily as ever, without the sense of any gap left by her departure. This leaving of the younger children she had decided to be for the best. Were she to remain, they would probably gain less good by her precepts than harm by her example. She went through Stour Castle without pausing, and onward to a junction of highways, where she could await a carrier's van that ran to the south-west, for the railways which engirdled this interior tract of country had never yet struck across it. While waiting, however, there came along a farmer in his spring cart, driving approximately in the direction that she wished to pursue. Although he was a stranger to her, she accepted his offer of a seat beside him, ignoring that its motive was a mere tribute to her countenance. He was going to Weatherbury, and accompanying him thither she could walk the remainder of the distance instead of travelling in the van by way of Casterbridge. Tess did not stop at Weatherbury after this long drive further than to make a slight nondescript meal at noon at a cottage to which the farmer recommended her. Thence she started on foot, basket in hand, to reach the wide upland of heath dividing this district from the low-lying meads of a further valley in which the dairy stood that was the aim and end of her day's pilgrimage. Tess had never before visited this part of the country, and yet she felt akin to the landscape. Not so very far to the left of her she could discern a dark patch in the scenery, which inquiry confirmed her in supposing to be trees marking the environments of Kingsbere, in the church of which parish the bones of her ancestors, her useless ancestors, lay entombed. She had no admiration for them now. She almost hated them for the dance they had led her. Not a thing at all that had been theirs did she retain but the old seal and spoon. "Pooh! I have as much of mother as father in me," she said. "All my prettiness comes from her, and she was only a dairymaid." The journey over the intervening uplands and lowlands of Egdon, when she reached them, was a more troublesome walk than she had anticipated, the distance being actually but a few miles. It was 2 hours, owing to sundry wrong turnings, ere she found herself on a summit commanding the long sought-for vale, the valley of the great dairies, the valley in which milk and butter grew to rankness, and were produced more profusely, if less delicately, than at her home, the verdant plain so well watered by the river Var or Froom. It was intrinsically different from the Vale of Little Dairies, Blackmoor Vale, which, save during her disastrous sojourn at Trantridge, she had exclusively known till now. The world was drawn to a larger pattern here. The enclosures numbered 50 acres instead of 10. The farmsteads were more extended. The groups of cattle formed tribes hereabout. There only families. These myriad of cows stretching under her eyes from the far east to the far west outnumbered any she had ever seen at one glance before. The green lea was speckled as thickly with them as a canvas by Van Alsloot or Salart with burghers. The ripe hue of the red and dun kine absorbed the evening sunlight, which the white-coated animals returned to the eye in rays almost dazzling, even at the distant elevation on which she stood. The bird's-eye perspective before her was not so luxuriantly beautiful, perhaps, as that other one which she knew so well, yet it was more cheering. It lacked the intensively blue atmosphere of the rival vale, and its heavy soils and scents. The new air was clear, bracing, ethereal. The river itself, which nourished the grass and cows of these renowned dairies, flowed not like the streams in Blackmoor. Those were slow, silent, often turbid, flowing over beds of mud into which the incautious wader might sink and vanish unawares. The Froom waters were clear as the pure river of life shown to the evangelist, rapid as the shadow of a cloud, with pebbly shallows that prattled to the sky all day long. There the water-flower was the lily, the crowfoot here. Either the change in the quality of the air from heavy to light, or the sense of being amid new scenes where there were no invidious eyes upon her, sent up her spirits wonderfully. Her hopes mingled with the sunshine in an ideal protosphere which surrounded her as she bounded along against the soft south wind. She heard a pleasant voice in every breeze, and in every bird's note seemed to lurk a joy. Her face had latterly changed with changing states of mind, continually fluctuating between beauty and ordinariness, according as the thoughts were gay or grave. One day she was pink and flawless, another pale and tragical. When she was pink she was feeling less than when pale. Her more perfect beauty accorded with her less elevated mood, her more intense mood with her less perfect beauty. It was her best face physically that was now set against the south wind. the irresistible, universal, automatic tendency to find sweet pleasure somewhere which pervades all life, from the meanest to the highest, had at length mastered Tess. Being even now only a young woman of 20, who mentally and sentimentally had not finished growing, it was impossible that any event should have left upon her an impression that was not in time capable of transmutation. And thus her spirit, and her thankfulness, and her hopes rose higher and higher. She tried several ballads, but found them inadequate, till, recollecting the psalter that her eyes had so often wandered over of a Sunday morning, before she had eaten of the tree of knowledge, she chanted: "O ye sun and moon, O ye stars, ye green things upon the earth, ye fowls of the air, beasts and cattle, children of men, bless ye the Lord, praise him and magnify him for ever." She suddenly stopped and murmured, "Perhaps I don't quite know the Lord as yet." And probably the half-unconscious rhapsody was a fetishistic utterance in a monotheistic setting. Women whose chief companions are the forms and forces of outdoor nature retain in their souls far more of the pagan fantasy of their remote forefathers than of the systematized religion taught their race at a later date. However, Tess found at least approximate expression for her feelings in the old Benedicite that she had lisped from infancy, and it was enough. Such high contentment with such a slight initial performance as that of having started towards a means of independent living was a part of the Durbeyfield temperament. Tess really wished to walk uprightly, while her father did nothing of the kind. But she resembled him in being content with immediate and small achievements, and in having no mind for laborious effort towards such petty social advancement as could alone be effected by a family so heavily handicapped as the once powerful d'Urbervilles were now. There was, it might be said, the energy of her mother's unexpended family, as well as the natural energy of Tess's years, rekindled after the experience which had so overwhelmed her for the time. Let the truth be told, women do as a rule live through such humiliations, and regain their spirits, and again look about them with an interested eye. While there's life, there's hope, is a conviction not so entirely unknown to the betrayed as some amiable theorists would have us believe. Tess Durbeyfield then, in good heart and full of zest for life, descended the Egdon slopes lower and lower toward the dairy of her pilgrimage. The marked difference in the final particular between the rival vales now showed itself. The secret of Blackmoor was best discovered from the heights around. To read aright the valley before her it was necessary to descend into its midst. When Tess had accomplished this feat, she found herself to be standing on a carpeted level which stretched to the east and west as far as the eye could reach. The river had stolen from the higher tracts and brought in particles to the vale all this horizontal land, and now, exhausted, aged and attenuated, lay serpentining along through the midst of its former spoils. Not quite sure of her direction, Tess stood still upon the hemmed expanse of verdant flatness, like a fly on a billiard table of indefinite length, and of no more consequence to the surroundings than that fly. The sole effect of her presence upon the placid valley, so far, had been to excite the mind of a solitary heron, which, after descending to the ground not far from her path, stood with neck erect, looking at her. Suddenly there arose from all parts of the lowland a prolonged and repeated call. "Wow! Wow! Wow!" From the furthest east to the furthest west the cries spread as if by contagion, accompanied in some cases by the barking of a dog. It was not the expression of the valley's consciousness that beautiful Tess had arrived, but the ordinary announcement of milking time, 4:30, when the dairymen set about gathering in the cows. The red and white herd nearest at hand, which had been phlegmatically waiting for the call, now trooped towards the steading in the background, their great bags of milk swinging under them as they walked. Tess followed slowly in their rear, and entered the barton by the open gate through which they had entered before her. Long thatched sheds stretched round the enclosure, their slopes encrusted with livid green moss, and their eaves supported by wooden posts rubbed to a glossy smoothness by the flanks of infinite cows and calves of bygone years, now passed to an oblivion almost inconceivable in its profundity. Between the posts were ranged the milchers, each exhibiting herself at the present moment to a whimsical eye in the rear as a circle on two stalks, down the centre of which a switch moved pendulum-wise, while the sun, lowering itself behind this patient row, threw their shadows accurately inward toward the wall. Thus it threw shadows of these obscure and homely figures every evening, with as much care over each contour as if it had been the profile of a court beauty on a palace wall, copied them as diligently as if it had copied Olympian shapes on marble facades long ago, or the outline of Alexander, Caesar, and the Pharaohs. They were the less restful cows that were stalled. Those that would stand still of their own will were milked in the middle of the yard, while many of such better behaved ones stood waiting now, all prime milchers, such as were seldom seen out of this valley, and not always within it, nourished by the succulent feed which the water meads supplied at this prime season of the year. Those of them that were spotted with white reflected the sunshine in dazzling brilliancy, and the polished brass knobs on their horns glittered with something of military display. Their large veined udders hung ponderous as sandbags, the teats sticking out like the legs of a gypsy's crock, and as each animal lingered for her turn to arrive, the milk oozed forth and fell in drops to the ground. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of Tess of the d'Urbervilles. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tess of the d'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy. Read by Adrian Pretzelis. Chapter 17. The dairymaids and men had flocked down from their cottages and out of the dairy house with the arrival of the cows from the meads. The maids walking in pattens, not on account of the weather, but to keep their shoes above the mulch of the barton. Each girl sat down on her three-legged stool, her face sideways, her right cheek resting against the cow, and looked musingly along the animal's flank at Tess as she approached. The male milkers, with hat brims turned down, resting flat on their foreheads and gazing on the ground, did not observe her. One of these was a sturdy, middle-aged man, whose long white pinner was somewhat finer and cleaner than the wraps of the others, and whose jacket underneath had a presentable marketing aspect. The master dairyman of whom she was in quest, his double character as a working milker and butter maker here during 6 days, and on the 7th as a man in shining broadcloth in his family pew at church, being so marked as to have inspired a rhyme. Dairyman Dick all the week. On Sundays, Mr. Richard Crick. Seeing Tess standing at gaze, he went across to her. The majority of dairymen have a cross manner at milking time, but it happened that Mr. Crick was glad to get a new hand, for the days were busy ones now, and he received her warmly, inquiring for her mother and the rest of the family, though this as a matter of form merely, for in reality he had not been aware of Mrs. Durbeyfield's existence till apprised of the fact by a brief business letter about Tess. "Oh, as a lad I knowed your part of the country very well," he said terminatively, "though I've never been there since.
and a aged woman of 90 that used to live nigh here, but is dead and long gone, told me that a family of some such name as yours in Blackmoor Vale came originally from these parts, and that 'twere an old ancient race that had all but perished off the earth, though the new generations didn't know it. But Lord, I took no notice of the old woman's ramblings, not I." "Oh no, it is nothing," said Tess. Then the talk was of business only. "You can milk 'em clean, my maidy? I don't want my cows going a zoo at this time o' year." She reassured him on that point, and he surveyed her up and down. She had been staying indoors a good deal, and her complexion had grown delicate. "Quite sure you can stand it? 'Tis comfortable enough here for rough folk, but we don't live in a cowcumber frame." She declared that she could stand it, and her zest and willingness seemed to win him over. "Well, I suppose you'll want a dish of tea or victuals of some sort, hey? Not yet? Well, do as ye like about it. But faith, if 'twas I should be as dry as a kex wi' travelling so far." "I'll begin milking now to get my hand in," said Tess. She drank a little milk as temporary refreshment, to the surprise, indeed slight contempt, of dairyman Crick, to whose mind it had apparently never occurred that milk was good as a beverage. "Oh, if ye can swallow that, be it so," he said indifferently, while a milker held up the pail that she sipped from. "'Tis what I hain't touched for years, not I. Rot the stuff! It would lie in my inwards like lead. You can try your hand upon she," he pursued, nodding to the nearest cow. "Not but what she do milk rather hard. We've hard ones and we've easy ones, like other folks. However, you'll find out that soon enough." When Tess had changed her bonnet for a hood, and was really on her stool under the cow, and the milk was squirting from her fists into the pail, she appeared to feel that she had really laid a new foundation for her future. The conviction bred serenity. Her pulse slowed, and she was able to look about her. The milkers formed quite a little battalion of men and maids, the men operating on the hard-teated animals, the maids on the kindlier natures. It was a large dairy. There were nearly 100 milchers under Crick's management, all told, and of the herd the master dairyman milked 6 or 8 with his own hands, unless away from home. These were the cows that milked hardest of all, for his journey milkmen being more or less casually hired, he would not entrust this half-dozen to their treatment, lest, from indifference, they should not milk them fully; nor to the maids, lest they should fail in the same way for lack of finger grip, with the result that in course of time the cows would "go a zoo," that is, dry up. It was not the loss for the moment that made slack milking so serious, but that with the decline of the demand there came a decline, and ultimately cessation, of supply. After Tess had settled down to her cow there was for a time no talk in the barton, and not a sound inferred with the purr of the milk jets into the numerous pails, except a momentary exclamation to one or other of the beasts requesting her to "turn round" or "stand still." The only movements were those of the milkers' hands up and down, and the swing of the cows' tails. Thus they all worked on, encompassed by the vast flat mead which extended to either slope of the valley, a level landscape compounded of old landscapes long forgotten, and no doubt differing in character very greatly from the landscape they composed now. "To my thinking," said the dairyman, rising suddenly from a cow he had just finished off, snatching up his 3-legged stool in one hand and the pail in the other, and moving on to the next hard yielder in his vicinity, "to my thinking, the cows don't gie down their milk to day as usual. Upon my life, If Winkler do begin keeping back like this, she'll not be worth going under by midsummer." "'Tis because there's a new hand come among us," said Jonathan Kail. "I've noticed such things afore." "To be sure, it may be so. I didn't think on't." "I've been told that it goes up into their horns at such times," said a dairymaid. "Well, as to going up into their horns," replied Dairyman Crick dubiously, as though even witchcraft may be limited by anatomical possibilities, "I couldn't say. I certainly could not. But as nut cows will keep it back as well as the horned ones, I don't quite agree to it. Do ye know that riddle about the nut cows, Jonathan? Why do nut cows give less milk in a year than horned?" "I don't," interposed the milkmaid. "Why do they?" "Because there bain't so many of 'em," said the dairyman. "Howsomever, these gamesters do certainly keep back their milk to day. Folks, we must lift up a stave or two. That's the only cure for't." Songs were often resorted to in dairies hereabout as an enticement to the cows when they showed signs of withholding their usual yield, and the band of milkers at this request burst into melody, in purely businesslike tones it is true, and with no great spontaneity, the result, according to their own belief, being a decided improvement during the song's continuance. When they had gone through 14 or 15 verses of a cheerful ballad about a murderer who was afraid to go to bed in the dark because he saw certain brimstone flames around him, one of the male milkers said, "I wish singing on the stoop didn't use up so much of a man's wind. You should get your harp, sir, not but what a fiddle is best." Tess, who had given an ear to this, thought the words were addressed to the dairyman, but she was wrong. A reply, in the shape of "Why?" came as it were out of the belly of a dun cow in the stalls. It had been spoken by a milker behind the animal, whom she had not hitherto perceived. "Oh yes, there's nothing like a fiddle," said the dairyman, "though I do think that bulls are more moved by a tune than cows. At least that's my experience. Once there was an old aged man over at Mellstock, William Dewey by name, one of the family that used to do a good deal of business as tranters over there. Jonathan, do you mind? I knowed the man by sight as well as I knowed my own brother, in a manner of speaking. Well, this man was a coming home along from a wedding where he had been playing his fiddle one fine moonlight night, and for shortness' sake he took a cut across 40 acres, a field lying that way, where a bull was out to grass. The bull seed William and took after him, horns aground, begad, and though William runned his best, and hadn't much to drink in him, considering 'twas a wedding and the folks well off, he found he'd never reach the fence and get over in time to save himself. Well, as a last thought he pulled out his fiddle as he runned, and struck up a jig, turning to the bull and backing toward the corner. The bull softened down and stood up, looking hard at William Dewey, who fiddled on, till a sort of a smile stole over the bull's face. But no sooner did William stop his playing and turn to get over hedge than the bull would stop his smiling and lower his horns toward the seat of William's breeches. Well, William had to turn about and play on willy-nilly, and 'twas only 3 o'clock in the world, and I knowed that nobody would come that way for hours, and he so leery and tired that I didn't know what to do. When he had scraped till about 4 o'clock, he felt that he verily would have to give over soon, and he said to himself, 'There's only this last tune between me and eternal welfare. Heaven save me, or I'm a done man.' Well, then he called to mind how he'd seen cattle kneel o' Christmas Eves in the dead of night. It was not Christmas Eve then, but it came into his head to play a trick upon the bull. So he broke into the Tivity hymn, just as at Christmas carol singing, and lo and behold, down went the bull on his bended knees, in his ignorance, just as if 'twere true tivity night and hour. As soon as his horned friend were down, William turned, clinked off like a long dog, and jumped safe over hedge before the praying bull had got to his feet again to take after him. William used to say that he'd seen a man look a fool a good many times, but he'd never seen such a fool as that bull looked when he found his pious feelings had been played upon, and 'twas not Christmas Eve. Yes, William Dewey, that was the man's name, and I can tell you to a foot where he's a-lying in Mellstock churchyard at this very moment, just between the second yew tree and the north aisle. It's a curious story. It takes us back to medieval times when faith was a living thing." The remark, singular for a dairy yard, was murmured by the voice behind the dun cow, but as nobody understood the reference, no notice was taken, except that the narrator seemed to think it might imply a scepticism as to his tale. "Well, 'tis quite true, sir, whether or no. I knowed the man well."
"Oh yes, I have no doubt of it," said the person behind the dun cow. Tess's attention was thus attracted to the dairyman's interlocutor, of whom she could see but the merest patch, owing to his burying his head so persistently in the flank of the milcher. She could not understand why he should be addressed as "sir" even by the dairyman himself. But no explanation was discernible. He remained under the cow long enough to have milked 3, uttering a private ejaculation now and then, as if he could not get on. "Take it gentle, sir, take it gentle," said the dairyman. "'Tis knack, not strength, that does it." "So I find," said the other, standing up at last and stretching his arms. "I think I have finished her, however, though she made my fingers ache." Tess could then see him at full length. He wore the ordinary white pinner and leather leggings of a dairy farmer when milking, and his boots were clogged with the mulch of the yard. But this was all his local livery. Beneath it was something educated, reserved, subtle, sad, differing. But the details of his aspect were temporarily thrust aside by the discovery that he was the one whom she had seen before. Such vicissitudes had Tess passed through since that time that for a moment she could not remember where she had met him, and then it flashed upon her that he was the pedestrian who had joined at the club dance at Marlott. The passing stranger who had come she knew not whence, had danced with others but not with her, had slightly left her and gone on his way with his friends. The flood of memories brought back by this revival of an incident anterior to her troubles produced a momentary dismay lest, recognizing her also, he should by some means discover her story. But it passed away when she found no sign of remembrance in him. She saw by degrees that since her first and only encounter his mobile face had grown more thoughtful, and had acquired a young man's shapely moustache and beard, the latter of the palest straw colour where it began upon his cheeks, and deepening to a warm brown further from its root. Under his linen milking pinner he wore a dark velveteen jacket, cord breeches and gaiters, and a starched white shirt. Without the milking gear nobody could have guessed what he was. He might with equal probability have been an eccentric landowner or a gentlemanly ploughman. That he was but a novice at dairy work she had realized in a moment, from the time he had spent upon the milking of one cow. Meanwhile many of the milkmaids had said to one another of the newcomer, "How pretty she is!" with something of real generosity and admiration, though with half a hope that the auditors would qualify the assertion, which, strictly speaking, they might have done, prettiness being an inexact definition of what struck the eye in Tess. When the milking was finished for the evening they straggled indoors, where Mrs Crick, the dairyman's wife, who was too respectable to go out milking herself, and wore a hot stuff gown in warm weather because the dairymaids wore prints, was giving an eye to the leads and things. Only 2 or 3 of the maids, Tess learned, slept in the dairy house besides herself, most of the helpers going to their homes. She saw nothing at supper time of the superior milker who had commented on the story, and asked no questions about him, the remainder of the evening being occupied in arranging her place in the bedchamber. It was a large room over the milk house, some 30 feet long, the sleeping cots of the other 3 indoor milkmaids being in the same apartment. They were blooming young women, and, except one, rather older than herself. By bedtime Tess was thoroughly tired, and fell asleep immediately. But one of the girls who occupied an adjoining bed was more wakeful than Tess, and would insist upon relating to the latter various particulars of the homestead into which she had just entered. The girl's whispered words mingled with the shades, and to Tess's drowsy mind they seemed to be generated by the darkness in which they floated. "Mr Angel Clare, he that is learning milking, and that plays the harp, never says much to us. He is a parson's son, and is too much taken wi' his own thoughts to notice girls. He is the dairyman's pupil, learning farming in all its branches. He has learned sheep farming at another place, and he's now mastering dairy work. Yes, he is quite the gentleman born. His father is the Reverend Mr Clare at Emminster, a good many miles from here." "Oh, I have heard of him," said her companion, now awake. "A very earnest clergyman, is he not?" "Yes, that he is. The earnestest man in all Wessex, they say. The last of the Low Church sort, they tell me, for all about here be what they call high. All his sons, except our Mr Clare, be made parsons too." Tess had not at this hour the curiosity to ask why the present Mr Clare was not made a parson like his brethren, and gradually fell asleep again, the words of her informant coming to her along with the smell of the cheeses in the adjacent cheese loft, and the measured dripping of the whey from the rings downstairs. Chapter 17